11 female vulnerabilities that give you total control. Machiavelli would use every one of them today. Here's the uncomfortable truth, and I want you to sit with it before we go anywhere. A woman doesn't lose interest because you suddenly became less attractive. Sometimes she loses interest because she became completely certain that you'll always be there, and that one shift changes everything. Because attraction isn't a simple function of how much attention you give someone. It runs on uncertainty, on scarcity, on emotional investment, on the perceived possibility of loss. Machiavelli understood a principle 500 years ago that still shows up in human behavior every single day. People value what they believe they could lose. Understand that one line properly, and you begin to understand why some men are constantly being pursued while other men spend their entire lives pursuing. Not because one is richer, not because one is better looking, not because one has some secret nobody else has. He simply understands something most men never learn. Access creates value only when access is not guaranteed. Think about a door. If a door is permanently open, you stop noticing it. You walk through without a thought. But if that same door can close, suddenly you're aware of it. You notice when it's open. You notice when it isn't. And most of all, you notice whether you still have the key. That's the mechanism we're pulling apart today. Not manipulation, not tricks, not controlling another human being. The vulnerabilities, blind spots, and emotional patterns that quietly govern attraction, and how your own behavior either strengthens or destroys your position inside that dynamic. Because most men make exactly the same mistake. They believe attraction is something you create by giving more. More messages, more attention, more explanations, more reassurance, more availability, more patience with things they should never have been patient about. But there's a point where more stops producing attraction and starts producing certainty. And certainty changes the entire emotional temperature of a thing. Machiavelli didn't write for men who wanted everyone to like them. He wrote about power, about incentives, about what people actually do when the pleasant appearances fall away and self-interest steps forward. And if he were alive today, he wouldn't tell you to become cruel. He'd tell you to understand the game you are already playing, whether you acknowledge it or not. Because every relationship contains a quiet negotiation. Who invests first? Who becomes more emotionally dependent? Who chases? Who pulls back? Who is afraid of losing the other person? And who genuinely knows, not performs, knows that they'd be fine either way? That's where real leverage lies. Today we're going through 11 vulnerabilities that appear again and again in attraction. 11 psychological blind spots that decide who invests, who chases, who becomes attached, and who slowly starts being taken for granted. And here's where most men get this immediately wrong. They hear the word vulnerability, and their mind goes straight to exploitation. That is not what this is. The goal is not to find someone's weak point and press on it. The goal is to understand the mechanism clearly enough that you stop destroying your own position through neediness, over-pursuit, and the endless low-grade hunt for reassurance. Because while one man is working desperately hard to convince a woman to want him, another man is simply refusing to abandon himself in order to keep her. Those are two entirely different psychologies, and they produce two entirely different lives. Number 11 matters more than all the others, and I'll tell you why now, so you don't switch off early. Plenty of men understand the first 10 and still lose the whole dynamic because they never internalize the final one. It's the one underneath everything else. It's the one that operates when nobody is watching. There's another reason to stay to the end. One of these vulnerabilities can genuinely change how someone responds to you, not because you learned how to control her, but because you finally stopped feeding the pattern that made you predictable. And that brings us to the thing most men do not want to hear. You don't lose women because you don't earn enough. You don't lose them because you're not charming enough. And you don't always lose them because some other man was better. Sometimes you lose attraction because you became completely predictable, always available, answering instantly, explaining everything, tolerating everything, proving your interest long after it stopped being in any doubt. Eventually, you stop being a possibility. You become a certainty. And psychologically, those are two entirely different objects. Think about your phone. If it never stops buzzing, you stop checking it, it's just noise. But when one particular notification arrives unexpectedly, your attention snaps to it. Who is that? Why now? What do they want? The brain notices what interrupts the pattern. That is not a theory about dating. That's how attention works in every mammal with a nervous system. That's why mystery matters. That's why scarcity matters. That's why emotional independence matters. Not because you should play games, but because a man with his own direction, his own standards, and his own boundaries creates a fundamentally different psychological experience from a man who is permanently waiting to be approved of. Machiavelli would have put it in colder language. Whoever controls access controls the value of access. And most men do the exact opposite. Unlimited access, unlimited attention, unlimited reassurance, unlimited chances. And then they stand there genuinely confused about why none of it seems to be appreciated. Attraction does not grow simply because you gave more. Sometimes it grows the moment you stop giving what was never being valued in the first place. That doesn't mean disappearing. It doesn't mean pretending not to care. It certainly doesn't mean ignoring someone to make them anxious. That's not strength. That's a man who needs leverage because he doesn't have substance. It means something much simpler. You stop negotiating against yourself. You respond without begging. You communicate without over-explaining. You show interest without surrendering your entire identity to it. And you become genuinely comfortable with the possibility that this person might walk away. Because the man who actually believes I would rather lose her than lose myself moves through the world differently. He doesn't threaten. He doesn't manipulate. He doesn't chase. His boundaries speak on his behalf. His absence carries weight because his presence had value. Once you understand these 11, you'll start seeing all of it. You'll notice when investment shifts. You'll notice when attention quietly becomes entitlement. You'll notice when someone is testing where the edge of your standards actually sits. And you'll finally understand why some men spend their lives auditioning while others are simply difficult to replace. But there's one rule before we go a step further, and it isn't a disclaimer. It's the whole thing. Never use another person's vulnerability to control them. Use your understanding of psychology to control yourself. That is the difference between manipulation and power. Manipulation is what a weak man reaches for when he can't generate the real thing. It works briefly, it costs him his self-respect, and it always ends the same way. Understand that distinction, and everything that follows becomes 10 times more useful. One more thing before we start. Somewhere in the comments, write the word control, not for the algorithm, for you. Because by the end of this, I'm going to give you one exact sentence to use when a dynamic turns emotional, confusing, or unnecessarily dramatic. One sentence. No arguing, no begging, no justification, no chasing. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man can say is the thing he refuses to say twice. Let's start. Vulnerability 1. The need for validation. You've seen this 100 times without recognizing what you were looking at. It arrives in harmless questions. Did you like it? How do I look? Are you mad at me? Why are you being weird? They sound innocent. Sometimes they genuinely are. But sometimes they're asking something underneath the words entirely. Do I still have your attention? And this is exactly where most men expose themselves. She asks for reassurance, and he's in there before she's finished the sentence. You look incredible. No, I'm not mad. Of course, everything's fine. Instant reassurance. Instant approval. Delivered with a speed that tells her he was already holding it, ready, waiting to be asked. For years, I thought that was just being a good man, being warm, being generous. But think about what happens when someone receives reassurance every single time they reach for it. It stops registering. It becomes ambient. It becomes weather. And weather is not something anyone values. Picture it. You're sitting with her and she tells you about something she pulled off at work. Most men go straight over the top. That's incredible. You're amazing. I'm so proud of you. She smiles. Fine. But what did those words actually cost you? Nothing. And that is precisely the problem. Real validation carries weight because it isn't automatic. One sincere sentence from a man who doesn't hand them out lands harder than 50 compliments deployed to keep someone comfortable. And here's the part that stings. A lot of men don't validate women because they want her to feel good. They do it because they're afraid. Afraid she'll cool off. Afraid she'll drift. Afraid that if they stop actively feeding the connection every day, she'll stop choosing them. So they keep giving. And the more they give, the more they need her reaction in order to feel secure themselves. That's the trap, and it closes slowly. It doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like being a good boyfriend. Selective validation isn't cruelty. It's emotional discipline. You don't need to approve of everything. You don't need to respond to everything. And you absolutely do not need to prove your interest every 5 minutes to a woman who already knows. The moment your approval becomes automatic, it stops being worth anything. Now, be careful, because when you stop playing that game, the dynamic will move. She might reach out more. She might tease you. She might drop an ambiguous comment purely to see what your face does. And sometimes what sounds like a joke is not a joke at all. It's a probe. And your reaction tells her more in half a second than your words will tell her in a month. That's where this stops being theory. Understanding all of this is easy. Staying level when you're actually emotionally activated, that's where most men collapse. And they collapse fast. And they collapse in ways they don't even notice at the time. Let me be specific about what the collapse looks like, because you'll recognize it. She goes slightly cool. He immediately gets warmer. She's short with him. He gets longer. She gives less. He gives more, faster, harder, trying to close the gap by pouring himself into it. He thinks he's fixing something. What he's actually doing is confirming her read of the situation. He's demonstrating that a small drop in her warmth is enough to reorganize his entire behavior. The grounded man does none of that. He stays exactly where he was. Same warmth, same tempo, same amount of himself in the room. Not as a tactic, because nothing has actually happened that would justify changing. And that non-event is one of the loudest things a man can communicate. Let me give you a real example, because this stays abstract otherwise. A man I know had been with someone for 2 years, good relationship on paper, and he'd developed a habit he wasn't aware of. Every time she seemed even slightly off, he'd ask if everything was all right. Not once, 3, 4 times in an evening. Are you okay? You seem quiet. Are we good? He thought that was attentiveness. What it actually was, running underneath, was a man checking the reading on an instrument every 10 minutes because he didn't trust the machine. And here's what it produced. She started managing her own moods around him. Not because he asked her to. Because every time she was tired or preoccupied or just quiet, she had to reassure him about it. A bad day at work now came with a second job attached, handling his anxiety about her bad day. So she started performing fine. And a woman who is performing fine is no longer resting with you. He stopped asking. That was the entire intervention. He noticed she was quiet, registered it, and carried on making dinner. If she wanted to say something, the room was there. Within about a month, she was telling him more, not less, because there was finally nothing to manage. That's the whole mechanism in one story. Reassurance seeking, dressed up as care, is still reassurance seeking, and it puts the weight on her every single time. Vulnerability 2. Uncertainty. The human mind cannot leave an unfinished story alone. You send a message, she doesn't answer. You can see she's online. 30 minutes go by, then an hour. And suddenly, you're not thinking about your work anymore. You're not thinking about your training. You're not thinking about anything except her. What happened? Did I say something? Is she losing interest? That's the power of an open loop. Not because silence is magic, because the brain demands closure. And when you don't supply the ending, it writes one for you, usually a worse one. This is exactly why predictability quietly kills tension. Imagine you text her at the same time every night. Same greeting, same rhythm, same questions, same emotional availability. On tap, 24 hours a day. You think you're demonstrating consistency and reliability. But eventually, there's nothing left for her to wonder about. She already knows. And once someone can predict every move you'll make, there is nothing left to discover. And discovery is where desire actually lives. Now, I am not telling you to vanish for 3 days to make someone anxious. That's not confidence. That's insecurity in a costume, and it reads as exactly what it is. Manufactured distance has a texture to it. There's a stiffness in it, a self-consciousness, a man performing unavailability while checking constantly whether it's working. Women pick that up immediately, and it does the opposite of what he intended. Real uncertainty comes from having a life that doesn't revolve around another person's attention. You reply when you're free. You make plans without filing a minute-by-minute report. You don't spiral when there's silence. You don't feel a compulsion to fill every empty space in the conversation. And those empty spaces matter enormously Because when you stop explaining everything, her mind starts doing the work instead. But here's the part almost every man misses. If there's nothing behind the silence, uncertainty just becomes emptiness. A man with no purpose cannot generate mystery. He can only generate confusion. If you go quiet and you were doing absolutely nothing, that eventually becomes obvious, because the man who returns from a busy week comes back with something in him. And the man who returns from 3 days of scrolling comes back the same, only hungrier. So, build a life worth disappearing into, not to manipulate anyone, because you actually have somewhere to be. And there's a moment where this principle turns dangerous. There's a specific signal that tells you she's no longer simply curious about you, that she's begun to emotionally reposition you into a different category entirely. Almost no man notices it as it's happening, and by the time he does, the repositioning is finished. I'll show you that signal later. It comes up naturally when we get to boundaries, and you'll know it the second you hear it. But first, we have to deal with the third vulnerability, because there's a world of difference between a woman thinking about you and a woman feeling genuinely understood by you. Vulnerability 3. The hunger to be understood. Most men think listening means keeping your mouth shut while she talks. It doesn't. Anyone can stay quiet. Anyone can hear words. Very few men can hear what's sitting underneath them. She says she's angry, but underneath the anger, she's hurt. She says she doesn't care, but everything about the way she says it tells you she cares enormously. She tells you about a problem, and she isn't asking you to solve it. She's asking whether it's safe to have the feeling in front of you. When a man can recognize that without rushing in to fix, correct, or optimize, something visibly changes. Her shoulders drop, her voice slows. She stops defending her own position because she no longer has to. For a moment she feels, he actually gets it. That is genuinely powerful, and it's rare. And most men never develop it because they were taught that being useful means producing solutions. But here's where men then destroy it. She opens up, and he becomes addicted to the feeling. He texts more. He becomes constantly available. He starts treating her vulnerability as proof that he's won something, as a scoreboard, as confirmation that the hard part is over. That's the moment connection turns into attachment, and attachment without self-control is just neediness with better manners. I've watched men change completely the instant a woman finally let them in. The tempo went, the center went. They started chasing the feeling of being let in, rather than simply being the man she let in. And she notices. There's no argument, no dramatic conversation. She simply starts seeing him differently, and neither of them could tell you exactly when it happened. So hold on to this. Understanding her emotions does not mean being governed by them. You can see what she feels, name it accurately, be genuinely moved by it, and still not hand over the wheel. Those are separate acts. Most men can't separate them, which is why so many collapse the moment real intimacy shows up. That distinction is the whole of Vulnerability 3. Because the next mistake isn't about creating attraction at all. It's about what happens the moment a man decides he's got her. That is almost always the moment the dynamic begins moving against him. Vulnerability 4. Emotional weather. If you've stayed with me this far, you've probably already noticed something uncomfortable. Attraction is never really tested when everything feels good. It's tested when the temperature changes without warning. One day, she's warm, texting first, laughing, fully present. And then, almost overnight, distance, short replies, less enthusiasm, a different tone that you can't quite point to but absolutely feel. No explanation offered. And this tiny shift will expose a man's entire psychology inside about 4 hours. The insecure man feels it instantly. Something tightens in his stomach. He checks his phone. Did I do something? What changed? Should I ask? Should I not ask? Should I say something light to test the water? And before he's aware of it, her mood is now running his mood. He's outsourced his emotional state to another person's weather. That's the trap, and almost every man has lived in it. The grounded man notices the same change. He isn't numb, and he isn't pretending. He cares. But he doesn't hand his nervous system over to someone else's behavior. He keeps his plans. He keeps his rhythm. He keeps his standards. He doesn't punish her with a matching coldness to make a point. And he doesn't chase her with 3 follow-up messages to close the gap. He simply refuses to become a different man because someone else's energy moved. And when she comes back, and she usually does, she finds exactly the man she left. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this video, because it communicates something no sentence could. You can affect me. You cannot run me. That is emotional stability, not indifference, not stonewalling, not pretending nothing touches you. It's the capacity to feel something fully and not be obligated to act on it in the next 10 seconds. Here's something practical, and it's smaller than you'd expect. When the temperature drops, do nothing for a day. Not as punishment, just carry on. Train, work, see your friends, live the day you were already going to live. If she reaches out, be warm, genuinely warm, no edge, no scorekeeping. If she doesn't, the day was still good. You'll find out very quickly whether you've built anything, because the discomfort in that 24 hours is a direct measurement of how much of your stability was borrowed. And this becomes far more important when actual chaos arrives. Vulnerability 5, conflict. The fifth one doesn't show up during flirting. It shows up under pressure, during arguments, in the moment when emotion is high and everyone in the room wants to be heard right now. I've watched men lose entire relationships in 10 minutes because they couldn't tolerate 10 seconds of silence. He raises his voice. She raises hers. He starts explaining. She interrupts. He explains harder, louder, with more detail, because surely if he can just get her to understand the sequence of events, this ends, and within a few minutes they aren't solving anything at all. They're fighting to win the moment. That's where a man's frame either holds or comes apart, and it's visible from the outside long before it's visible from the inside. Being solid for someone does not mean matching their intensity. Sometimes the strongest available response is slower, quieter, and considerably shorter. I can see you're upset. I'm not going to keep talking while we're doing this to each other. Then you stop. No speech, no threat, no 20-minute defense of your character. A boundary and the willingness to hold it, delivered at a volume that doesn't need to be matched. Because calm is not weakness. Calm is what's left when you no longer need the other person to agree with your position before you're able to stand on it. And when the storm passes, something important remains. Trust, not the shallow kind you talk about. The instinctive kind, the sense that when everything goes sideways, you will not become part of the chaos. That's when attraction turns into something with a foundation under it. Because anyone can be impressive on a good day. The only real question is who you are when the room catches fire. I want to add one thing here, that the average version of this advice leaves out. Staying calm is not the same as being right. There will be times when she is completely correct and you are not, and holding your frame while being wrong is just being difficult with better posture. The point of composure isn't to win the argument by outlasting her. It's to make it possible to actually find out what's true, because two activated people never find out anything. If she's right, say so. Immediately, cleanly, no self-flagellation. That takes more strength than holding a bad position calmly for an hour, and she'll clock the difference instantly. There's one more thing about conflict that almost nobody covers, and it's the part that decides whether a relationship survives 10 years or 4. What happens afterwards? Most men treat the end of an argument as the end of the event. The volume comes down, somebody concedes, and the whole thing goes in a drawer, but the drawer fills up. And 2 years later, there's a fight about a dishwasher that is not about a dishwasher, because there are 11 unresolved things stacked underneath it. The grounded move is to come back. Not that night, necessarily, but within a day, calmly, without the emotional charge, and say the true thing. I was defensive last night because I felt like you'd already decided I was the problem. That's on me, not you. What did you actually need from that conversation? That is not weakness, and it is not an apology tour. It's a man who is confident enough to look directly at the thing, rather than hoping it decomposes on its own. And the reason this matters for everything else on this list is simple. A man who can repair doesn't need to avoid conflict, which means he doesn't need to fold to keep the peace. Which means his boundaries can be real, because holding one no longer risks a permanent rupture. Repair is what makes strength survivable inside a relationship. Without it, every man eventually has to choose between his standards and his peace, and most of them choose peace, one small surrender at a time. Vulnerability 6, quiet status. This one is uncomfortable, because real status cannot be faked for long, and almost everything men do to signal it makes it worse. I'm not talking about money, not clothes, not a title in a bio. I'm talking about presence. The way a man walks into a room without needing anyone to register it. The way he speaks without rushing. The way he handles being challenged without going defensive or going loud. People feel that within seconds, and they can't tell you why. Watch what happens when someone interrupts a man mid-sentence. The insecure one either laughs it off, because being liked matters more to him than being finished, or he overreacts, because being seen as weak terrifies him. Two opposite reactions, and both reveal the identical thing the room is running him. A grounded man needs neither. He looks at the person, pauses, and says, "Let me finish." That's it. 3 words. No aggression, no apology for occupying space, no long justification for why his sentence deserved to exist. Status lives in details that small. Your posture, your eye contact, your volume, the number of words you use where 3 would do. The ability to say no without producing a written explanation nobody asked for. And here's the brutal part. The more comfortable you become in yourself, the less you need to perform any of this. Arrogance needs an audience. Confidence doesn't notice whether there's one. There's a trap here, and men fall into it constantly after watching videos like this one. They hear all this and conclude they should become cold, dismissive, a bit hard, slightly intimidating, reduce the warmth and call it frame. That's not status. That's insecurity in a nicer jacket, and it's transparent to anyone with any social intelligence at all. Real presence is warm. It's steady. It's completely unbothered by disagreement. It doesn't need to make anybody smaller in order to feel large. And once a woman registers that, she starts measuring something deeper than whether you're impressive. She starts measuring how seriously you take yourself. And that measurement happens in places you'd never think to defend. How you speak to a waiter, whether you finish what you start, whether the thing you said you'd do on Monday actually happened, whether you complain about your job every week and do nothing about it, whether you're the man in the group who gets talked over and laughs along with it. None of that is romantic. All of it is being read. Because a woman is not primarily assessing how you treat her, she can see how you treat her, and any man can manage that for 6 months. She's assessing how you treat everything else, because that's the honest sample. That's the version of you that isn't being curated. Men consistently get this backwards. They put enormous effort into the interaction with her, and almost none into the life she's watching him live. And then they're baffled when the interaction goes perfectly and the interest still fades. It faded because she saw the rest of it. Which means the fastest route to quiet status isn't a better posture or a slower voice. It's closing the gap between what you say you're going to do and what you actually do, in every direction, including the ones nobody's watching. That gap is your status. It's the only thing that ever was, which is exactly where the next problem begins, because you can build attraction, you can develop emotional stability, you can carry real presence. And then, one small boundary gets crossed, a joke with a hook in it, a last-minute demand, some behavior you already said you don't accept. And the man who looked unshakable 10 minutes ago starts negotiating against himself. "I didn't mean it like that. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Forget I said anything." And she watches. Not because she's trying to dominate you, usually she isn't consciously doing anything. But behavior reveals what words conceal, and a boundary with no consequence behind it isn't a boundary. It's a preference you announced once. We'll come back to that, because that's where this whole thing eventually lands. Vulnerability 7. Consistency. By now you'll have noticed that attraction rarely collapses in one dramatic moment. It leaks. One contradiction, one broken promise, one boundary you decided not to mention. And eventually, the person you're working so hard to keep starts quietly wondering why she should respect you, and she won't be able to point to a single event either. Here's where it shows up. When things become comfortable, the performance stops. She's no longer trying to impress you. You're no longer trying to impress her. And that's when people show you who they actually are, which is exactly what you wanted and also exactly what most men refuse to look at. She says honesty matters to her, and then the story changes when the truth is inconvenient. She says she hates being ignored, then goes dark for a day with no explanation. She says she doesn't play games, then creates a situation designed to see what you'll do about it. And most men notice every bit of it and say nothing. They tell themselves it's not worth the argument. And sometimes that's genuinely true. Not everything needs to be litigated, and a man who audits every inconsistency is exhausting to be near. But silence has a price, and it compounds. Every time you accept something that contradicts a standard you've stated, you're teaching the other person what your standards are actually worth, not what you say they're worth. What you'll tolerate, those are the only numbers that get read. You don't need a confrontation. Often it's one sentence. You told me this mattered to you. That's why this stood out. Then stop talking. No sarcasm. No accusation. No closing argument. Just accuracy. Because now she has to sit with the gap between what she said and what she did, and more importantly, she knows you saw it. Not that you're angry about it, that you saw it and you're not the kind of man things get past. That's not control. That's discernment. And it is one of the most attractive qualities a man can have, because it means his approval is connected to reality rather than to hope. And here's the harder half of this, which almost nobody says out loud. The same test applies to you. If you tell her you don't do something and then you do it, you've just taught her the same lesson about yourself. A man who holds others to a standard he doesn't meet isn't demonstrating strength. He's demonstrating that his standards are a negotiating position. Consistency is not a weapon you point at her. It's a floor you stand on, and it only works if it holds your weight too. Vulnerability 8. Direction. I'm not talking about having your whole life mapped out. I'm talking about knowing which way you're facing, because I've watched men slowly turn into passengers in their own lives without ever noticing the moment it happened. He asks for permission before making decisions that are entirely his. He adjusts his opinions depending on who's in the room. He hesitates, then overthinks, then looks to somebody else to tell him what he should want. Every choice gets outsourced, one small piece at a time. And eventually the relationship inverts. Instead of walking beside a man, she feels like she's carrying one. That is exhausting, and it kills desire faster than almost anything else on this list. Not because she wanted a dictator, because she wanted a partner and got a dependent. Real direction is quiet. You listen, you consider, then you decide. You don't need everyone to agree. You don't need to announce every move. You don't need it validated before you'll commit to it. You simply move, and you own the result, whichever way it lands. And here's the line that changes the entire dynamic, though you will never say it out loud. I know where I'm going, whether you come with me or not. That's not a threat, it's independence. And strangely, it produces a kind of security nothing else can, because she no longer has to wonder whether you'd fall apart without her. A man who would fall apart without her is not safe to lean on. He's another thing to manage. But don't confuse direction with rigidity. A rigid man demands. A grounded man decides. He can change his mind without losing his identity. He can be persuaded without being pushed. He can compromise on the route without abandoning the destination. That's the difference, and women read it instantly. And once she feels that kind of direction, something shifts in how she relates to you. She stops feeling like she's managing your life. She starts feeling like she's choosing to be part of it. Which brings us to the vulnerability, where most men find out whether her investment was ever as deep as they'd assumed. Vulnerability 9. The difference between being available and being valuable. Most men cannot tell these apart, and the confusion costs them everything. They believe security means always answering, always being there, always adjusting, always saying yes, never being the reason anything is difficult. But here's the uncomfortable mechanic underneath that. When someone knows they can reach you at any moment, without effort, without timing, without ever wondering your presence, slowly becomes background noise. Not because she's ungrateful, not because she's cruel, because certainty changes how any human being behaves, including you, including me. Think about it honestly. If you cancel your plans every single time she calls, you are not demonstrating devotion. You're demonstrating that your life can be rearranged on request. And she learns that. So does everyone else in your life, incidentally. Your friends learn it. Your employer learns it. A man who has never once said no has trained the entire world to stop asking whether it's convenient. Real security comes from choice. She knows you're there because you want to be, not because you're afraid of what happens if you're not. That is a completely different energy, and it can be felt from across a room. You don't announce that you're busy. You don't post something strategic, hoping she notices. You don't invent a reason to be unavailable on a Thursday. You simply have somewhere to be. Your work, your training, your friends, the thing you're building. And when she wants to see you, sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is not tonight. I've already got something on. No attitude, no lesson attached, no pause before you say it to make sure it lands, just reality. That balance is enormously powerful, close without dependent, available without automatic, warm without self-abandoning. And here is precisely where men detonate everything they've built. The moment they notice her investing more, reaching out first, making the effort, opening up, they panic in the direction of gratitude. Finally, she's in. So they overcorrect, cancel the plans, give more attention, become permanently reachable, pour everything into the opening. And the exact tension that produced her investment evaporates, usually within about 3 weeks. Then he's confused because he was being so good to her. The lesson is simple, and most men will still ignore it. Never manufacture scarcity. Build a life that makes you naturally scarce. Because when your time genuinely has value, your presence feels entirely different, and eventually she'll find herself wondering, without ever saying it, what actually happens if I lose him? Not because you threatened anything, not because you played a single game, because she can see that you have the capacity to walk away from something that stops respecting you. And I want to be precise about what that capacity actually is, because men mistake it for a threat, and it isn't one. It's not something you say, it's not an ultimatum you keep in your back pocket, it's not even a decision you've made. It's a structural fact about your life. It means that if this ended tomorrow, you would still have your work, your training, your friends, your direction, your Saturday mornings, and something to get out of bed for. You'd be sad. You'd probably be sad for a long time. But the architecture would hold. A man who has that doesn't have to reference it and shouldn't. It shows in 100 small non-events, the plans he doesn't cancel, the argument he doesn't chase, the day he doesn't ruin because a message went unanswered. A man who doesn't have it can't hide it, no matter how many videos like this one he watches. Because the tells aren't behavioral, they're structural too. There's nothing in the calendar. There's nobody else calling. There's no project. And so every interaction with her carries a weight it was never designed to hold, and she can feel that weight in the room even when neither of them can name it. Which is why the real work here isn't in the conversation at all. It's in the 6 months before the conversation, built out of things nobody witnessed and nobody clapped for. Which brings us to the moment that exposes absolutely everything. Vulnerability 10, the moment a boundary gets tested. Attraction, respect, direction, presence, investment. None of it survives if your boundaries dissolve the first time somebody leans on them. And it almost never happens dramatically. It's a joke that goes a bit too far, a comment with something underneath it, a repeated inconsistency you've already mentioned once, a small manipulation delivered as humor so that objecting would make you the difficult one. And you're standing there with a specific feeling in your chest, thinking, do I say something? That hesitation is the entire battlefield. Everything is decided in it, because what you do in the next 10 seconds tells her whether your standards are real or whether they're things you say when nothing is at stake. The average man takes one of two roads, and both are the same road. He negotiates, explains, softens it, sends the paragraph nobody asked for, laying out his reasoning, hoping she'll agree that his boundary is reasonable, which is itself a request for permission to have it. Or he detonates, voice up, says something with real damage in it, regrets it by morning, and spends the next 3 days repairing ground he only lost because he couldn't sit still for 2 seconds. Different reactions, identical weakness. Neither man is actually standing on anything. The grounded man needs neither. He doesn't threaten. He doesn't lecture. He isn't trying to win a point or extract an apology. He simply decides what he will and won't participate in. His voice gets quieter. His sentences get shorter. His actions get clearer. And if the behavior continues, he doesn't escalate. He leaves the room, the conversation, or eventually the relationship, not as punishment, not to trigger a chase, because his self-respect finally outweighs his fear of the empty flat. And this is the signal I promised you earlier, the one that tells you whether she respects your standards or simply enjoys having access to you. Watch what happens the first time you hold a boundary calmly. A woman who respects you will feel the boundary land, and something in her will settle. She may not like it, She may push back, but there'll be a quality of relief underneath the friction, because she's just discovered there's a floor. A woman who is only enjoying the access will do something different. She'll escalate. She'll test whether the boundary bends under enough emotional pressure. She'll go for the softest thing she knows about you. That's your answer. It arrives inside about a minute, and it's usually the clearest information you'll ever get. And I want to say something honest here, because this section gets abused. Not every pushback is disrespect. Sometimes she's upset because you were wrong, or because you delivered something badly, or because you named a boundary in the middle of an argument as a way of ending it rather than as a genuine standard. A boundary used as a weapon in a fight isn't a boundary, and men do this constantly while congratulating themselves on their frame. The test is simple. Would you hold this exact standard if you weren't angry? If the answer is no, it isn't a standard, it's a move. The final mistake most men make is believing that keeping the peace is the same thing as keeping the relationship. It isn't. Sometimes keeping the peace means abandoning yourself in installments. And do it often enough, and you don't just lose her respect, you lose the man you were in the process of becoming, and that one is much harder to get back. And here's the sentence I promised you at the start. Use it only if you are actually prepared to live by it, because a boundary you announce and then abandon does more damage than never having said anything at all. I don't stay where respect is lost. I genuinely wish you well. Then stop. No second paragraph. No desperate follow-up an hour later. No checking whether she's typing. No message at midnight, because the silence became unbearable, and you needed to know she was still there. You said what you meant, once, and then you let your actions carry the rest. Because closure does not require permission, and self-respect does not require applause. Understand what you're doing when you say it, though. That sentence is not a technique to make someone chase you. If you deploy it as a move, hoping she'll panic, hoping she'll come back, watching your phone to see whether it worked, you've just proved to yourself that you didn't mean it, and that knowledge sits in you afterwards. It doesn't matter whether she noticed. You'll know. The first time a man genuinely follows through on something like that, something inside him permanently changes. He stops tolerating what he used to rationalize. He stops trading dignity for attention. He stops confusing loneliness with a reason to accept anything that's offered. And strangely, people begin responding to him differently across his entire life. Not because he became colder, because he became harder to move off his own ground, and human beings can smell that from a considerable distance. Which brings us to the last one, the one sitting underneath every other vulnerability we've covered. Vulnerability 11. Integrity. This is the quietest one, and it's the only one that actually determines whether any of the other 10 survive contact with real life. Because integrity isn't what you say when people are watching. It's what you do when nobody is. How do you handle rejection when there's no audience for your composure? What do you do at 11 at night when the loneliness gets loud, and the easiest thing in the world would be to send the message you already decided not to send? Do your standards hold when breaking one of them would cost you nothing and nobody would ever find out? That's where the actual man is, and it's the only place he is. A man can talk about discipline while being run entirely by anxiety. He can preach self-respect while quietly begging for attention in ways he'd never admit to. He can build an entire identity around boundaries and then abandon every one of them the moment the fear of being alone gets sharp enough. Integrity means the actions and the identity are the same object. You don't betray yourself to avoid an empty evening. You don't say something you don't mean because it'll smooth the moment. You don't hold a standard in public and a different one in private. And when a woman feels that consistency in a man, something changes that she will not be able to articulate. She'll just sense that you're solid. Not perfect solid, predictable in principle and unpredictable in the good ways. That's what holds everything else up. Attraction fluctuates, emotions move, chemistry comes and goes with sleep and stress and seasons. Respect is the thing the whole structure actually stands on, and respect is downstream of integrity, always. There's one more thing I want to say about this, because it's the part that separates the men who take this seriously from the men who just enjoy hearing it. Integrity is expensive. That's what makes it worth anything. It costs you the relationship you could have kept by pretending. It costs you the easy evening. It costs you the version of yourself that everybody found agreeable. If it never costs you anything, you haven't got it yet. You've just never been properly tested. Machiavelli is usually remembered as the patron saint of doing whatever works. That's a shallow reading of him. What he actually understood was that appearances are unstable, that people act from self-interest, and that a man who doesn't understand the incentives around him becomes an instrument of somebody else's. The application here isn't to become ruthless with women. It's to stop being naive about what you're doing to your own position every day, and to stop handing away the only leverage you ever really had, which was never leverage over her. It was leverage over yourself. So let's land this. 11 vulnerabilities. The need for validation, the pull of uncertainty, the hunger to be understood, emotional weather, conflict, quiet status, consistency, direction. The difference between available and valuable, the moment a boundary is tested, and integrity underneath all of it. Now, do not make the mistake of turning these into another performance. You don't need to become colder. You don't need to memorize a set of behaviors and run them on somebody. Every man who does that ends up looking like exactly what he is, a nervous man executing a strategy, and it fails within a month, and he blames the strategy. Take one, just one, the one that made you uncomfortable while I was describing it, because that's the one that's actually yours. If you chase, reclaim your rhythm. Take back the hour, the plan, the evening you were about to cancel. If you need validation, practice going without it for a week and notice what comes up. It will be more than you expect. If you tolerate disrespect, enforce one boundary calmly and completely, and then hold it when it gets tested, because it will get tested, usually within days. Because standards were never meant to make women afraid of losing you. They're meant to stop you losing yourself. And when a man stops abandoning himself, he stops begging to be chosen. That's the whole thing. Everything else in this video was a description of what that looks like from the outside. One last thing, and it's the thing I'd want said to me. Women are not the enemy in any of this. Not one of the 11 is a weapon. Every single one of them describes a way in which a man either holds himself together or quietly comes apart. And the fact that a woman can feel the difference isn't a conspiracy, it's just accurate perception. She's not the problem. The problem was that you were negotiating against yourself and calling it love. Fix that, and you don't need any of this. Nobody does this alone, and the men who try usually quit inside a month. It's a great deal easier to hold a standard when other men are holding one too. If you would like to join a community of men on the same journey as you are on right now, join our Discord. Link is in the description. That's exactly what it exists for. And if you want to go deeper, you can join as a member for extra content, the longer breakdowns, and the material that doesn't fit in a video like this one. Now, before you go, put it in the comments. Write exactly this. I stopped negotiating. Not for the algorithm. Because naming it is the first honest move most men ever make, and everything after it gets easier. This is Freedom Forge. See you in the next video.